Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, on wherever you are. Today, I have someone I have been talking to for years on matters agriculture, Team A-Wise, who is the author of Eating Tomorrow, Agribusiness, Farmers, and the Battle for Food. And he's also a researcher at Tufts University. So if you're interested, you can find his book. It covers the topics that we are about to talk about. So Team has worked a lot on African agriculture, and over the years, we've discussed on how the whole agricultural system has sort of failed to keep or to give Africans food security. Some of the obvious data that most of us know is that Africa has the world's largest uncultivated arable land, but yet it imports somewhere in the line of $50 billion of food every year. And the main imports have now become rice, wheat, and maize, which are not necessarily the most indigenous African crops. And again, in the news, we always see that millions of people, hundreds of millions of people are food insecure in the continent, usually in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa, and this is a recurring problem that countries and the continent, have tried to solve. Yet we haven't been able to solve these issues, primarily because as most of the experts will say, is Africa has very low yields, and it needs to improve its yields so that it can be able to feed its people. And so that comes with some issues that today we will discuss with Team on the history and some of these issues and the way forward to improve, or at least to facilitate the continent being able to feed itself. So Team, I just want us to begin from a little way back in post-independence Africa. I know I'm generalizing when I say Africa, and we can get into the details of specific countries. But what was the food system and the agriculture like? And how did we transition to becoming a very wheat, rice, and maize dependent continent over the years, over the decades?
No, thanks, Sam. It's good to be with you. I think all stories go back to colonialism, right? And the colonial era was one where there was foreign investment in the form of colonial investments in plantation agriculture. There was different forms of indentured servitude on farms, debt peonage, and depending on the colonial master and the regimen in the particular country. And what that did was created a bifurcated agriculture that produced export crops for the colony, for the colonial masters, and did very little to develop the agriculture of small-scale farmers or even local food production. Where you got development for local food production, it was sometimes to produce food for the very workers who were doing the work for the colonizers. The most obvious example being maize in Southern Africa, which became the staple food for miners, and for other workers in apartheid's economic system. And so you end up with this really skewed set of agricultural relationships and bifurcated agricultural economies with a subsistence sector completely underinvested and and increasingly pushed onto the most marginal lands, particularly as populations grew and as colonial societies and then post-colonial societies, cities grew and started to press outwards and demand food. And they started to demand food that those local farmers couldn't supply for the cities. And I think in a lot of countries, small-scale farmers were actually quite self-provisioning during the colonial era when they weren't being extorted by the colonizers. But as cities needed food, who was going to grow the food? In Malawi, they were growing tea on tea plantations for the British. Cash crops for export. All the best land devoted to that, and kind of varies, as you said. Africa is not a country. Varies widely what that looks like in different countries. But I think that's how I would characterize the sort of pre-independence distortion of what could have been a very different kind of agricultural growth trajectory.
And what kind of food crops were there on the continent? And I know it probably varies around the continent in general, but I'm also interested in the nutritional loss that we've had over the years. What was the diet on the continent?
I don't know. I mean, like I said, that is a hard one to generalize about. And in some places, for example, maize made a very early entry onto the continent, partly because it was a colonial crop, came via Portugal, and was via the Americas, via Portugal, and came to Eastern Africa, and was seen to be a very productive food crop to keep the poor from starving and feed the cities. And it's continued to evolve into being, in many countries, the overwhelmingly dominant crop. But in other places, but that doesn't mean that that farmers weren't growing a whole wide variety of more traditional crop, what we call traditional crops now, and they would just call food. From millet, sorghum. I mean, the grains that they were growing were not typically rice, wheat, and maize. I think they were a lot of tubers. Cassava was not a colonial introduction, I don't think. Some of the potato crops were introduced late. Sweet potatoes and yams, I don't think they were indigenous to Africa, but I think they were very. They've been there a long time. And then all of the grains and the nuts, which form the basis of a lot of cuisine in places like West Africa. Again, protein source is nuts or legumes with local grains, and some, again, local chicken, right? But not large scale animal production.
Yeah. I think a few years ago, I saw this research being done out of, I think it was in Kenya, where they were trying to genome sequence some of this indigenous African crops so that we maintain, at least if we ever get back to using them, we have them in a database somewhere. And then so as we move forward, and we mentioned these three crops, maize, wheat, and rice, how have governments with the policies as well as investment from foreign investors, be it corporations or philanthropic agencies, how have those three crops kind of stayed within the food system on the continent? And again, here, because we've talked about how there's a challenge there, and I know you're going to raise some of the issues that you've been talking about previously. But just take us through what happened both in policy from governments in Africa, as well as from corporations?
Well, again, not to overgeneralize. I mean, this is by definition overgeneralizing, but I don't want to be accused of overgeneralizing. But post-independence, there were in a lot of countries governments that had fought and won their independence that wanted independent economies as well. And for a lot of them, food security was a top priority. And a lot of them saw value in investing in the crops that the colonizers had been growing or encouraging as food crops, but either making them national industries or putting in place stimulus programs to encourage a greater level of production, to feed growing cities, to improve food security in the countryside. And so there's a built-in, I'm thinking partly of maize in Eastern and Southern Africa. There was a real built-in incentive to double down on growing more corn. I mean, you just grew more maize because that's what farmers were already doing. That's what they'd been taught to do. That's what, so let's grow more of it. I think the idea of restoring a kind of crop diversity, and it was a much bigger challenge for a centralized African governments that were trying to quickly take the reins of independent economies and trying to assure food security, kind of their first obligation to their citizens. But that meant in the course of the years, they both find that they can't do that because they don't have the investment and they don't have the good land is still in these plantations in a lot of places, and they start relying more on foreign investment or on foreign aid, bilateral aid programs, and those were heavily biased toward cash crops in general, toward these staple starchy staples, as they're called in the development world, that produce a lot of calories for the amount of land and money and labor invested in them. So they produce a lot of calories, but they don't produce a very good nutritional diet. They're great as part of a diet, but not as the diet. And in poor communities, they often become the diet, and do not alleviate malnutrition, even if they alleviate severe hunger with high carbohydrate counts.
Yeah, I mean, even on that, just if you would just zoom in on stunting and the impact that focusing on this crop and making them their diet, what that does to malnutrition and specifically with stunting.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and one that I was dismayed when I went out to start researching my book in 2013. First time really spending a lot of time in Southern Africa, and I was really disturbed to see that I thought we had all gotten past, we in the development economics field had all gotten past this idea that, well, the stages of development are that first you need to fill people's stomachs with calories, and only then after that can you start to think about diverse crops and more broad-based nutrition. And I think that we went past that point at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. I think that was outmoded in the 90s, but there and the head of the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa was talking exactly like that, like in her home country of Rwanda. We had to fill their bellies and make sure they were going to survive and got enough calories before we could think about about a nutritious diet. And then again, the downside of that is that heavy promotion of, in that case, maize, came at the expense of all those other crops. It's like you look at country after country and the amount of land devoted to other crops, other more nutritious, more climate resilient crops like millet, sorghum, sweet potato went down. The yields went down because we weren't getting investments and the land was being put into maize. And that results, like you said, in a different kind of malnutrition. Maybe there's enough calories to keep people alive, but children are not growing at the rate they should be growing. Children are wasting. Wasting is the other category that the FAO tracks. And there was some improvement going up to the early 2000s, and then things really leveled off. People are pretty dismayed that there hasn't been more improvement since then.
Yeah, I mean, I was also very surprised when I first learned about stunting and wasting, and the fact that it's also permanent. That 4 or 5 decades later, if this population makes it to 40 years old, then they may also have an obesity problem. And over their lifetime, it affects not just their physical growth, but also the intellectual growth, which is a very important part of the economy that's being wasted because of the malnutrition as well. But I mean, if I make the same argument that, okay, first you have to fill the bellies before you get to nutritious food, at the beginning that kind of makes sense, right? And we have to, because the population keeps growing, we have to continue trying to increase the yields on these things that we can produce in mass so that we can fill the bellies. Where do you think the fault line came in that argument? I know you mentioned that the other ones were ignored, but if you're focusing on putting food in the stomach, where is the fault line in saying, okay, let's increase the yields, and how do we do that? I'm not saying that actually even succeeded, but and how do we do that? What's wrong with that kind of policy?
Well, I think in a way it's asking the wrong question. I mean, if you're truly in a situation where people are starving, you obviously need to give them whatever food you have, and hopefully, and this is what the best of the World Food Program humanitarian assistance does, they don't give people cornmeal, simple cornmeal. They give them a more balanced, nutritional meal that's going to get them back on their feet, because they know that just filling their bellies isn't going to be enough. I think where things I think went so wrong is that in part people looked at these, populations growing. We need to grow more food for the growing people in the growing cities and rural areas with population growth. Let's grow more of what they already have in their fields. And the answer was monoculture, right? The answer was stop growing all that other stuff you have in the field with your corn, with your maize, and grow your maize more densely and intensively using fertilizer and quote unquote improved seeds, hybrid seeds usually that came from commercial crop breeders, mostly from the global north. And again, that's a really ready at hand answer for development professionals from the global north, because they'd already developed those seeds for the global north in wheat, in rice, in maize. So here are our seeds. They produce a lot high yields where we are in huge monocultures. They can do the same for you. And on some level, it's just a failure of the one-size-fits-all development model. You're not going to make Malawi look like Iowa, but that's kind of the vision. And it's kind of the vision that, unfortunately, I found development professionals like Agnes Kalibata, the head of Agra, she really, her kind of origin story is really, she talks so proudly about traveling in Iowa and saying, why can't we do this? And unfortunately, she wasn't truly asking that question. Like, why can't we do this? It's like, well, there's a whole lot of reasons why you can't do that and you wouldn't want to. But she was asking it like, we're not that backward. We should be able to be this productive. And she was just plain wrong. It was just not the right formula for a continent dominated by smallholder farming, chopped up land in small plots on wildly varying types of land, quality of land and types of land in wildly varying ecosystems. And without capital. The capital is what drives that Iowa farm. And where's the capital going to come from? Where's the land going to come from? You can't just say, oh, let's have massive, 40,000 hectare farms and bring in the combines, because people live there. You don't have anywhere to put them. So instead of starting with who are we and what do we have to work with, where we live, where our people live, they started, I think, with this one-size-fits-all image of what agricultural development looks like, and just tried to imprint it on Africa in different ways. That's an oversimplification, but it's not I don't think it's wrong. And I think people have learned a lot in the last 10, 15 years and have been backtracking from such a simple understanding.
I mean, that's actually a very good explanation for it. That the question itself at the beginning was not the right question to ask. So whatever answer you get is not going to be the right answer.
Well, or it's, it's sort of like you put, the way I just put it, it was the right question, but it wasn't a real question. A real question was, wow, why can't we do that? It's like, okay, well, let's explore that. That's a really good research question. Why can't Africa do what Iowa does? All the examples that we have now from all the failed development experiments all over Africa will give you the answers to that question. But nobody was asking it with an open mind.
Yeah. But, and the other thing that I found very interesting was the sort of sustainability, or the continuous sustainability of this non-solution that was implemented. And it came with, again, some interesting policies that later on farmers also were shocked to find out. Like, now it's become part of a conversation in Kenya. But in 2012, Kenya had a law that made it illegal for farmers to share the indigenous seeds. I can understand the reasoning behind it, but it also came with, let's work on imported high yielding seeds and the fertilizer, and it created this little economy where they got into microcredits with farmers. It became a self-sustaining little industry without the solution itself. And I know you've worked a lot on that. But what is, again, I like your oversimplification of things, but can you just explain how that happened and why and why now we are trying to reverse from it?
Well, I wish we were actually trying to reverse from it. I mean, a lot of farmers and farmer organizations and African organizations and progressive development organizations are trying to shift toward more agroecological farming that puts low input. The common feature of a lot of these systems is low inputs, meaning you're not forcing poor farmers to purchase inputs or governments to subsidize the purchase of those inputs. So it's inexpensive and it's soil sustaining. So it rebuilds soils by the way you're farming. in the long run, making soil more fertile, land more fertile, and productivity goes up from soil fertility. It also goes up from planting a diversity of crops, and that adds to all kinds of resilience, climate resilience. One crop fails in a drought, they don't all fail, and social resilience, because you always have something to eat, and your land is getting, you're not over leveraged by the purchase of all these inputs. So a crop failure isn't a financial failure. It's just that you don't have enough to eat, but you have other crops growing, so you have something to eat. And I saw projects like that everywhere I went in Africa that were, great. They were amazing. And that's what I came out from my book research asking. That's sort of the core question in the book, is if this high input, high cost agriculture isn't delivering either yields or income increases or food or decreases in food insecurity, and all these farmers are showing a much cheaper way to get much better results that actually help the poorest of the poor in rural Africa, why aren't governments doing that? And that's the conundrum. Why aren't governments doing that? And they continue not to do that overwhelmingly. So the backtracking, I wish there was more backtracking from that model, but not yet.
Can you just zoom in a little bit on your main finding, which is that there's a lot of investment from governments and international aid agencies as well as corporations over the years, but there was no real increase in yields. I was going to say impact, but it depends on who you ask on the definition.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, the case study that I've looked at a lot is the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which came on in 2006, started by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with some development partners like USAID and UK Aid, a few other donors as well. Their goal was to double productivity and incomes for 30 million small-scale farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, which is, depending on how you count, that's nearly all of them, and cut food insecurity in half by 2020. And when I went and looked at it, they were nowhere near any of those goals, and we're going backwards on a lot of them. I mean, the food insecurity goal is just, it should be the wake-up call and the indictment of the entire policy, because instead of food insecurity going down by 50%, which was the goal, it went up by 50%. 50% more people severely malnourished and severely chronically hungry in sub-Saharan Africa, and in the particular focus countries of AGRA, of the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. Again, sort of mind-boggling, where they spent $1 billion over 15 years, and where they got governments buying into these same programs to provide subsidies that collectively added up to another $1 billion a year to subsidize the purchase of seeds, commercial seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, and other inputs. Wildly expensive program, terrible results. And you say, well, who benefited from that? And the answer is the companies that sold all those inputs. And that, again, was sort of the aha moment for me in this research. It's like, oh, okay, this isn't a failed program from the perspective of Seedco or Monsanto selling maize seeds in Malawi. They've got a captive purchaser in the government who's providing subsidized seeds to 2 million small-scale farmers. And the fertilizer companies have subsidized purchases by people who would never have the money to purchase fertilizers. So they've created markets for these commercial firms, mostly multinationals. Occasionally, some national firms would break into that, but not without having to compete against Seedco and Monsanto and the big companies. And so it was just a kind of a way to siphon money through farms into companies' pockets from development agencies and national governments, and without seeing that much in the way of results.
Mm. The response I've heard from at least Agra on that is there were conditions that were beyond the control, conflict in some countries, there were extreme weather incidences, droughts, as well as 2020, there's the COVID pandemic. What do you make of those three as being part of the reasons why they were not able to meet the goals?
Well, I mean, no one foresaw COVID. In retrospect, there are a lot of people who now say we should have, that we weren't taking the kind of public health measures that could have prevented a pandemic that took so many lives and was so disruptive. But that aside, how do you sit in sub-Saharan Africa in 2006 when Agri was started and they set their goals and not see that climate change is real, that it's affecting farmers, that there are conflicts on the continent, that conflicts disrupt food supplies and food deliveries, that, I mean, you come from a country where in the 80s, since the 80s, you've seen conflicts causing starvation and famine and food insecurity. This was not news. So it's kind of a sad commentary on the leaders of an initiative like Agra that they can make that excuse. Because where were you? Why did you not know that these were real things that were impacting farmers? They've been impacting farmers for a long time. They've been impacting economies for a long time. It either speaks to their heads being in the sand or them being, and I think it's probably more the case, more just very beholden to this model of agriculture. They were just, I call it a faith-based initiative because they have absolute faith that given the right conditions, the Green Revolution can massively increase productivity and food security and incomes in Africa. And they just can't accept that those conditions are never going to prevail in any foreseeable time horizon, and that this is the wrong way to get there. Faith-based initiative, we still believe. And, that's what you see from Bill Gates. He still ponies up after all these, he commissioned there hadn't been any evaluations of Agra that were independent or even published by the agency itself or by its donors until after I did a report on it. And they finally did Gates commissioned an evaluation, and it was damning that they hadn't met their goals, that their productivity hadn't increased very much, that incomes weren't much better off, that richer male farmers benefited more than women farmers, that larger scale commercial farmers were the main beneficiaries, if there were beneficiaries at all, but that overall food security didn't improve. Out of Gates' own commissioned evaluation, and they put a new strategy in place, and he ponies up $200 million more for the next 5-year period. And the beat goes on. Very little, the one thing that Agra did, responding to all this criticism and failure, was that it announced it was taking the word Green Revolution out of its name. So it would heretofore be known, this was 3 years ago now, known as Agra, the acronym. And, I said at the time, oh, well, so Agra now actually literally stands for nothing. Because it's not changing its strategy appreciably. It's just trying to distance itself from this, what's now perceived as a tarnished model. I saw an interview with Agnes Kalibata that came out on, I think it was DevX, because she just retired as the head of Agra, and they asked her about the Green Revolution and why they took the name out, and she said, "Oh, the Green Revolution ship has sailed." Like, and I was like, it's like more like the Green Revolution had a massive shipwreck, and the shipwreck happened actually long before it got to Africa, and most of the people who worked on the Green Revolution recognized that even in a place like India, it had been at best mixed and quite possibly a step backwards in term environmentally, for food diversity and nutritional diversity, soil health, water tables, you name it. That, you didn't have the Ford Foundation, which sponsored the first Green Revolution, crowing about how we need more green revolutions around the world. They had pretty much concluded that this was an interesting and mostly failing experiment.
Yeah. And speaking of Ethiopia, they have embarked on I don't know if you've seen it, this large-scale clustered wheat farming that is trying to make Ethiopia a net exporter of wheat. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, what kind of wheat are they looking to export?
I don't know.
Commercial durum wheat, probably. Not teff. It's like, there's no one can argue that African countries don't need cash, don't need export crops, and don't need sources of foreign exchange from exports. You can't just say, oh, everyone should just grow and eat their own food. That said, where's the coherent national development plan of which that is a part, that is envisioning something more long-lasting and more democratic in terms of who it's feeding, who it's employing, and who it's benefiting. How does a project like that not just become the beneficiaries, just become the people who are buying the cheap wheat from Ethiopia and the companies that are selling it, and the input providers who are providing all the inputs that are no doubt also often subsidized by the Ethiopian government. I mean, again, it looks more like a cash cow for a bunch of companies than it looks like a strategy for growing more food for Ethiopia, or for that matter, the Horn of Africa.
Do you have any examples of anywhere on the continent where there is at least some governmental leadership towards a more diversified, or at least a strategic agricultural policy that tries to solve for these issues that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I could say that there's a government that really exemplifies this alternative path. I think what we've started to see, which is encouraging, but perhaps happening too slowly, is that I think a lot of governments are realizing that these policies that they've been following are expensive and not very productive. And so in a lot of national agricultural policies, like in Zambia, in Kenya, where else have I seen? In Tanzania, I think too, there were notable in sort of openings to agroecology and other such low input agricultural development initiatives. And what was striking about them was that they were small, but they were there, and they were the product of a lot of hard work by farmer organizations and activists to say, no, we need to start looking at other alternatives here. And some of them were ready to do some important things, but literally Agra parachuted in with consultants and undermined, I know, 2 of those policies in Tanzania and Zambia, saying, no, that's not the way to go. What you need is agri-poles. That's the new word, farm blocks. You need, development projects that have an anchor farm. And I saw this 15 years ago when I started researching my book. It's like, or 10 years ago, that these kinds of things are entirely attempting to pull in foreign investors who mostly don't come because they don't see the market. They don't see the value in the market as being worth their money. And these big development projects just languish with, sometimes they've appropriated the land, sometimes they've kicked smaller scale farmers off that land to make room for these projects that don't go anywhere. And that's really the kind of the alternative. The African Development Bank is now spearheading a version of that. They've become the new, I'd say largest scale promoter of green revolution industrialized agriculture on large scale farms, on using the most modern technologies available, et cetera, only, where are these farms and how are they actually increasing food security for the people of Africa?
And I've also seen at least an increase in grassroots, sometimes even faith-based activism going on against this. But how sure, I guess we cannot be sure, but how much research is there to show that the agroecology is going to be the method that's going to not just feed the population, but also give them a diet that is nutritious?
Yeah, I think that story is yet to be told, because what you have are a lot of pilot projects that show a lot of promise. The other area that I've worked a lot recently, and over many years, is in Mexico. And Mexico had a government that flipped over from very pro-neoliberal policies, free trade policies, to more nationalist policies and more grassroots policies. And in agriculture, that was marked starting in 2018. And they have national agroecology initiatives that they tie their local subsidy programs for small farmers to agroecology programs. They train and experiment in new techniques. And they promote them. And you see a massive uptick in the viability of these programs. Farmers who are on what's called the technology treadmill, and a lot in Mexico are, because there's a lot of Mexico's not as little developed a country as some countries in Africa, right?
Yeah.
There's big capital there, there's big farms there, there's also a lot of small farms and indigenous farms, and a true mix. But what you see on these pilot programs is that the farmers who are in them are overjoyed. This one guy told me when I interviewed him for my book, he said, and I said, well, but have your yields stayed as high as they were before? And he said, not in the first 2 years when I made this shift away from chemical agriculture, but my profits were 3 times as high because I wasn't spending money on fertilizers, on seeds, on pesticides, on other inputs. And now, 3 years on, my soil is so much more fertile that I am getting the same yields I was before. Why is that not the formula for increasing food production in Africa? And again, there are projects that there's a project that's being run by well, I don't know if I'd call it a project. It's an initiative that's been adopted by a number of development agencies like Catholic Relief Services, called, it has a funny name, green manure cover cropping, which where I come from, green manure and cover cropping sounds like no-till agriculture and just, throw down on your massive monoculture of corn, throw down some rye over the winter to keep the roots in the ground and to put some nutrients back in over the winter. In Africa, where he's doing it, it's with small-scale maize producers, and all they do is they go in and look at these monocultures of maize and say, with a little more careful management and a good leguminous crop to plant alongside your maize plants, you could dramatically improve your soil, sequester carbon, add a food crop or a fodder crop for your animals, and massively increase your maize yields. And that's what happens. Their maize yields, in their experience, triple without any added inputs except this additional soil building intercropped leguminous crop. Or sometimes they use what are called fertilizer trees that stabilize the soil and put nutrients into the ground that are needed to grow maize. And they grow 3 times the amount of maize that they did before. They had very low yields before, but 3 times as much is way beyond what Agri's goal was, and they achieve it in 4 or 5 years. And the soil gets better and better, which is, again, that's, I think, the encouraging thing, is that there's much more attention to soil health now as a key element of agricultural development. And you can't have soil health if all you're doing is planting monocultures and dousing it with fertilizer year after year. That's just a recipe for mining the soil, the nutrients out of the soil.
Yeah. I mean, one of the main investments that I hear that's going to be happening on the continent, at least in the agricultural space, is very large fertilizer companies. So maybe it's still going the way it's been going for the past couple of decades. But
that's the dream. That's their dream. Their dream, I think, is that, the Green Revolution apologists explain away some of their failures by saying, well, it's just that fertilizer is so expensive on the continent because we don't produce it ourselves and it has to be shipped long distances. And it's true that it's more expensive in a place like a landlocked country like Malawi, and that there aren't close places where it's produced, because it's produced using natural gas. And so a lot of the attention is to places where there is natural gas that could be used to produce fertilizer on the African continent, more fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer on the African continent, and that would bring down the cost of the Green Revolution experiment somewhat. They're not wrong about that. Whether that really makes the difference in making it a viable development model, I have my doubts.
Yeah. I mean, I guess when you take your lens off just agriculture into the economy, the governments have this goal of feeding the people, putting food in their bellies, reducing imports of wheat and fertilizer. So it does make sense from a larger economic perspective, not necessarily from a food systems line of view.
No, I think that's right, and I think, again, one of the positive trends is this greater attention to recognizing that food systems are indeed big, complicated systems that are made up of lots of different parts, and that there's not some sort of it should take you away from one size fits all kind of northern-based solutions to say, well, what's the food system in Zambia look like? And maybe we look at the food system in Zambia and say, wow, they have some cultivated arable land that could be sustainably put into food production, why don't we have sponsor a colonization program to encourage farmers who are land poor to move to this new region where we'll give them startup money like the US did when it moved west. That was the basis for a lot of agricultural development in the US, was US subsidies, 40 acres and a mule to go west, and you get a plot of land and you get some initial startup money to farm it. Why not? Why not put poor farmers on better land? Why not put them on in groups where they can market what surplus they get and buy what inputs they need as a group? I mean, again, these are like really old nationalist development strategies that used to be right on the table when governments talked about how they should develop their agriculture. And now I just think the global economy has so distorted those choices that you have agribusiness sitting at the table, and multinational agribusiness says, no, you don't want to do that. Don't go that way. And donors like the Gates Foundation will say, no, we're not going to, that's moving backward. Let's move forward.
I'm seeing more and more branches of this agribusiness coming onto the table. And I think that Green Revolution way of doing agriculture seems to be still the dominant way of doing business on the continent. But team, is there anything else that you wanna add on this point? This has been a very good conversation so far.
No, I've enjoyed it. Thanks for having me. I don't think people should underestimate the power of the alternatives that farmers and non-governmental organizations and aid agencies who have been working with small-scale farmers for a long time have created. I literally saw them everywhere I went, and they were so inspiring. I mean, and so straightforward. This project in Malawi, central Malawi, Malawi is the most maize concentrated monoculture, small-scale monoculture economy in Africa. They, in this one community, nutritionists came in from a local university and said, how can we help these terrible diets? And they said, how about restoring crop diversity? And they started with a local variety of bright orange maize that was incredibly high in vitamin A. And they went and had to test it. And they said, is this really as nutritious as it seems? And it was. And they said, well, let's propagate this. Let's encourage people to use this, not some commercial seed that the government is promoting that you have to buy every year. These can be replanted year after year. That meets the small scale farmers' economic profile. They don't have money to lay out every year for seeds, and it grows well without fertilizer. And instead of fertilizer, let's encourage intercropping and multi-cropping of fields with other fruit crops. And they went from being a maize-dependent community to eating from the 5 different food groups that are recommended. They added in nutritional cooking classes to remind people how to cook the foods that they used to know how to cook, but that had gone dormant from inattention and from the conversion of planting to maize. Nutritional profiles went up. The quality of the soil kept improving because they weren't dumping fertilizer on it. They were intercropping it and feeding it with the nutrients it needed. They got small-scale animals like goats to provide manure. Just a wildly successful story that, again, the punchline of that is that when I saw those same farmers in an exhibition in the capital city of Lilongwe in Malawi, the president came by to tour these various stalls that were presenting, I think it was climate resilient agriculture was the theme. And one of the farmers from this community handed him a bag of their bright orange maize flour used to make enshima, in the staple in Malawi. And he looked at it and said, "Oh, is this from Monsanto?" And she, very impressed. She was on TV when she was talking about this. She very impressively kept her cool and said, "No, actually, this is a natural resource, a national resource that grows in our community. It's been growing there for generations, and it's higher in vitamin A than even the commercial varieties. And I think we should look at it as a national resource." That's the mindset, though. If it's good, it's got to be from a multinational. And that project, as far as I know, has not been scaled up by the government. In fact, they tried to pass a seed law that would have made it illegal for the farmers in that community to sell those bright orange maize kernels to development agencies to propagate that same kind of maize in other communities. They successfully fought back against that seed law. So it wasn't as draconian as some of these seed laws are. But again, who benefits from policies like that? The seed companies, commercial seed companies. And when I asked a guy in the NGO world who had worked on this seed law, I said, "This policy reads like it could have been written by Monsanto." And he literally looked down at his shoes and looked up and said, "Well, one of the authors was the former head of the Monsanto office here." It's like they're writing the policies in their own favor, and that's what local farmers are up against, and that's what
it's not surprising.
People who want to see a food system change are up against too. They're at the table and they're paying the money and writing the policies.
Yeah. Okay, team. On that note, I'm gonna end it here. Thank you very much for being generous with your time and your knowledge, not just today, but over the years. I appreciate it. Thank you.
No, thank you, Sam. I look forward to seeing your article and your interview.
Thank you.